But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This is in Genesis 6:8. God said to Noah, make yourself an ark. Genesis 6:14. So he and his sons labored, it looks like, for 100 years building this thing. And of course there was no rain, so everyone's laughing. And these giants walking by and said, you idiot, what are you doing building an ark? You can see what he had to do. He had to earn his own keep and food and yet build this big thing, which is bigger than the largest wooden ship we've ever built. But it's built like a barge, not like a ship. It's very stable. 450 feet long, I think 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. He went and preached to the spirits in prison who formerly were disobedient, when once the divine long-suffering, God's been long-suffering with man in his sin, waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. This is from 1 Peter 3:19 and 20. Of the clean animals, of the animals that were unclean, of birds, and of everything that creeps on the earth, 2 by 2 they went into the ark of Noah, Genesis 7, 8, and 9. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on that day, all of the fountains of the deep, of the great deep, broke up. See, the earth was watered by an artesian effect before. There's no rain, so it says a mist came up. So there's water under the surface. In fact, Neptune is called the god of the underworld, and yet you always see him in water and everything. And that's because that was the source before this flood. But these broke open, and the windows of the heavens were open. Genesis 7:11. The windows of the heavens were open. This is a spectacular view of, we have to use present deals that we show of what would have probably taken place from storms we have today. And on that day, all the fountains of the deep were broken up. This is a tsunami characteristic, breaking out. 7:11. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days, 7:14. During the flood, massive tectonic movements, that's these movements of the earth that we have earthquakes from, these fissures sliding on each other, and they jump, and that's what creates an earthquake. Well, this flood waters would have run to the low places, forced them up, and so these land masses are starting to move, but it creates fissures that these volcanoes come up, and they create worldwide volcanic eruptions. A single eruption, like even Mount St. Helens, I've been to the blast zone, is very spectacular, but they've had some that were much greater than that, some that lowered the temperature of the earth, we think 3 degrees. So you can imagine if these are taking place all over the earth, and we have evidences of it. We have huge flows, even in North America, that cover us down there, basalt, volcanic stuff that are enormous flows. Worldwide volcanic eruptions during the flood filled the atmosphere with volcanic ash. The large amounts of volcanic ash in the atmosphere created massive storms during the flood. This is one that storm's created by a volcano going off. It creates tremendous static deal and tremendous violence. Worldwide volcanic eruptions under the floodwaters cause earthquakes and massive tsunamis. These are things that are going off, explosions from under the sea. These are not man-made, these are natural phenomena. Massive tsunamis during the flood destroyed and buried animal and plant life. We had one not too long ago that wiped out, they think, between 250 and 300,000 people in Southeast Asia. Just one tsunami. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upwards, and the mountains were covered. All flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, cattle, beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. In other words, man, who's given dominion of all these things, his dominion suffers with him and his consequences. Now, it's not going to change the stars or anything. This is only going to change the earth, but it wipes out all the land animals. When that door was closed, and you know who closed the door on the ark? God did. He didn't pull it tight and lock it down. God evidently closed it up and sealed the whole thing so it wouldn't take in water on the door on the side. The violence of the floodwaters displaced and deposited worldwide geological sedimentary layers by fast-moving water. If you look at those sedimentary layers, you realize those weren't products of long periods of time. They're very sharp lines. They're due to mass watershed events. Deep sedimentary layers, this is after the flood. Deep sedimentary layers full of fossils were deposited by the catastrophic flood waters over the surface of the earth. Some deep sedimentary layers were cut through by huge flood waters while still soft. This is the Grand Canyon, and they say that it was pushed up, formed a dam, and the waters built up above it, and then all of a sudden broke through and cut through. But it would not cut this way if it was a long process. This had to be a catastrophic erosion because it cuts a mile deep in a very short amount of time when these things were still soft. Deep sedimentary layers were folded without fracturing while still moist and soft by tectonic movements during the plains. In other words, this one, like in Australia, was laid down flat, and then these things moving around bent the whole thing up. Well, you can't bend that when it's hard. It'll fracture into little pieces. But it was bent while it was soft and moist, in a short amount of time after they were laid down. Huge tropical forests were uprooted and deposited by the flood waters, forming massive alluvial, that means laid down by water, coal beds throughout the whole earth. You find coal beds everywhere on the earth. The fountains of the deep, however, and the windows of the heavens were also stopped, and the rain from the heavens were restrained, and the waters receded continually from the earth, Genesis 8, 2, and 3. Then the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat, Genesis 8, 4. Noah looked, and indeed the surface of the earth was dry, 8:14. It's a different world that he's going to step out on. It's desolate, but it's dry at this point without hardly any vegetation. In fact, they didn't get out of the ark until the dove brought back the olive branch, the symbol for peace. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh." In other words, God's gracious even to the unclean animals in this thing, bringing out by pairs. Noahic covenant. "I will establish my covenant with you and your descendants," Genesis 6:18. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings on the altar. You see, it's the same thing from Adam that Cain didn't learn, and others. When they made peace with God, it had to be by blood sacrifices. "I will set my rainbow in this cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." And of course, if you didn't have rain before, you wouldn't have rainbows. After the flood, the volcanoes continued to push up large new land masses and mountains. In fact, on the top of Everest, Everest is the fossil. It's got sedimentary layers, and the fossils are marine fossils on the top of Everest at nearly 30,000 feet. See, these things continue to push up even after the flood. Without a water canopy, waters above, the post-flood earth developed cold temperatures at its poles. Because the canopy's gone, it doesn't spread the temperatures out anymore. So you get polar regions. Without a water canopy, the post-flood earth developed very warm temperatures at its equator. They're not moderate anymore. You get the direct radiation and too much of it. It's not intercepted by the water canopy to be spread out. After the flood, massive volcanoes caused by the flood tectonics ominously spewed ash into the atmosphere. And we know that there was huge things, even western Kansas, the chalk beds and all those things were laid down by massive volcanoes a long ways away from them. Volcanic ash clouds blocked solar radiation and rapidly cooled the atmosphere to very low temperatures on the continents. Cold atmospheric temperatures and massive volcanic eruptions triggered huge storms, particularly in the new polar regions that didn't exist before the flood. Volcanoes and the warm ocean moisture, this is supplying the moisture that comes out. The oceans were at 70-some degrees temperature. Well, then this all changed. They're still pumping up moisture as they cool down. And all of it, we know that our weather comes from our oceans, basically. Even in Kansas and stuff, it all comes from particular points. The hotter they are, the more storms we have. So these were pumped by cold continental temperatures and massive moisture coming in. These massive polar snow blizzards continued day and night. Blizzards blanketed the polar landscape with massive accumulations of snow day and night. Huge mammoths and other extinct animals feeding on semi-tropical grasslands. We know that's what they're eating because they've opened up some of them and they've got the foods in their stomachs still. They were eating tropical and semi-tropical plants. You could even tell they think at what time of the year it was done. We're trapped by the flood waters and by the post-flood snows. This is a taxidermy of a mammoth that they've extracted. Millions of the pre-flood animals perished in the flood and were frozen by the post-flood snows. They're about 10 to 12 ton animals. Fierce polar snow blizzards continue to cover up the newly formed mountains and fill the valleys. Fed by moisture from warm oceans, the polar blizzards continued unabated. Descendants of Noah were driven back by the blizzards to the warmest part of the earth near Babylon. That's why they're gathered for the Tower of Babel down there. They can't go north. And even here in Kansas, we were covered up with glaciers in the middle of summer. The final push of the glaciers were to the south of here. And we have remnants, glacial remnants here that are brought in here like this quartzite from 700 miles away up from Minnesota. We don't have those quartz types of products here. And so these descendants were shoved back rapidly. The Ice Age snow covered all of the Earth's polar terrains. The deep snow compacted into Ice Age glaciers more than a mile deep. The Ice Age glaciers begin to move, pushed by large snow accumulations and pulled by gravity. These huge glaciers ground up everything in front of them, even mountains. These continental-sized glaciers changed all the terrain, moving glacial materials hundreds of miles. Moisture to produce the intense but brief Ice Age snow and glaciers came from warm oceans, which lost 300 to 500 feet of depth because it's all on land and snow. Antarctica, for instance, even though they get only 2 inches of precipitation a year, contain about 95% of the fresh water in the world. Well, you can imagine if you took the water out of the oceans to form these glaciers, the oceans drop, and we know that that is true from the deposits around that are underwater now. As the volcanoes stopped, the atmosphere began to warm up, and the warm oceans cooled, and the glaciers began to melt. Great rivers created by the melting glaciers returned the snow melt water to the oceans. The melting Ice Age glaciers left a strange landscape and glacial deposits in their wake. Geological structures left by the flood of Noah and Ice Age. Massive alluvial layers from the Noahic flood and the glacial Ice Age are the basic building blocks for modern civilization. You see the good things coming out of this? The rock and the sand all came about from this flood. Even the coal beds, our energy supplies and oil, came about from what? Things that were buried in the flood. Science and its laws harmonize with the biblical creation, fall of man, and the Noahic flood. The basic laws originated at 2 historical events in Genesis 1 through 3. The physics of life, light speed supports the biblical account of a young universe. Geological layers agree with the biblical account of the pre-flood earth conditions, climatic, environmental, geophysical, and biological. Fossil records confirm the biblical account of pre-flood plants and animals, which we have lost about 99% of them. We only have 1% left, according to evolutionary biologists. Sedimentary and igneous and metamorphic formations affirm the biblical account of a catastrophic worldwide flood and the post-flood Ice Age. Recent floods, volcanic Eruptions, tsunamis, and earthquakes confirm on a small scale the effects of a biblical worldwide flood. Glacial deposits verify the biblical post-flood ice age. Modern physics, geology, astronomy, biology of secular naturalism cannot explain either the origins or the present conditions of the earth, universe, and life. Scientific laws and data confirm God's creation of the universe and catastrophic worldwide results of God's judgment in the flood, contrary to natural science.